Hey guys, another feedback video based on my last couple of reference. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, I have a free art course slash community on Skool. You are welcome to join and it is 100% free. The link is on screen. Okay, just make sure that you post your joins under post joins under community, so it's easier for me to see them and it's more well organized. Also, someone posted a very good suggestion, which is organizing my references that I gave you guys. Now there is a section references under classroom. Okay, note that each of my feedback is according to that particular artist's skill. Previous references such as the dog, I have talked about in my last feedback video, so check those out. I will more specifically talk about the new references. Overall, pretty good. Make sure you pay extra attention to the subtle proportions and shapes of things. For example, this part here should be like this, right? And the value here should be darker, especially area A and area B. B is a little bit lighter than A. The area here should be significantly darker, especially this entire zone. And this one, in the image, it is very faint and it's much more subtle. While here, it's much brighter in a large area. You basically got tricked by relative value. You compare it to the surrounding value. So it's important to step back and look at the value as a whole. Again, this one, I'm assuming the paper is pure white, not this kind of shade of blue, and the charcoal is pure black. This is a very good one. You correctly paid attention to the value here versus there. Pay attention to the edges. Notice how sharp the edges are in the image. While it's much more, that contrast is kind of lost, right? It's more blurry in the drawing. You have the flexibility to do that as an artist, but unless you can draw the reference to very accurately in all areas of just take the style away for now and focus a little bit more on the reference. For example, you can see that this area here should be much darker. There should be a dark area here, especially the edge. The eyes are very good. This eye is very close to accurate. Notice that there is a highlight right here. Now, you might think I'm just being picky and maybe you notice it. And notice the value here. I understand that you're using textured paper, but you can use the charcoal to go over it a few times and that darkness will be created. Because you clearly can create darkness by judging by the pupil and this area here. First, pay more attention to proportions. This seems to be a very common mistake that people do. In the image, the cat, the shape of the head is more, I'm going to exaggerate, okay? Is more like this. And people are generally make it a little bit more rounder than what it's supposed to be. And you can think of it in terms of square. While the reference is more like this. Right? It's shorter, it's horizontally a little bit wider. So yeah, just make sure you gauge the proportions and spend some time on that a little bit more because those are so important. I like that you made the background a little bit darker so that you can create that white of the whiskers and you overall getting the contrast, right? This drawing basically forces new artists to really not be afraid to put the dark tone down. This drawing, I really like how accurately you captured the value, the subtle value of the whisker. More obviously, this area here should be noticeably darker. Check out the proportions. Again, when I point these things out, it always becomes obvious. The goal is for you yourself to notice them very clearly and easily. Look at the reference. It's actually very symmetrical. And if you look at your drawing, it's not that as symmetrical, right? This part is a little bit further that way. The relationship between eye and the nose is good, but look at the mouth. It's here. And the chin is roughly here. Not this far down. You can much easier to see this by look at the corner of the mouth, draw a dot to the bottom of the chin, and compare that to the reference. In the reference, it looks something like this. So learn to recognize that kind of proportion issue. And if you look at it at the tone value, right, you can see that this line here has a transition zone roughly from about this long. And in your drawing, you don't really see it. In the reference, it clearly goes from a tone of gray in the shadows to very bright. And in your drawing, that's absent. So just pay attention to things like that. Like this part here is pure dark, and this part here is also pure dark. But in your drawing, obviously there is a difference. This one, you have a sort of transition appearing there, which is good. Just make sure this area here is a little bit more smooth, and especially if you look at the image, right? It's very subtle, but this part here is actually darkest as you transition to the bottom. Slightly so. The other thing, if you look at the distance of the eye, you'll see that this is too far. This cat is slightly flat in terms of height, right? So if you look at the image, the cat's head, the shape is again something like this, and this image is more like, again, I'm exaggerating a little bit, more like that. Another issue is that it seems to appear a lot. Look at the area of here, too bright. Another important issue, especially with drawing the head, is be really careful with tiniest indentations and angles. There should be a slight angle here. This is completely straight, almost like a straight curve. When in the drawing, there's some tiny movements, which is especially important later on. Let's say you want to draw figures, and there are tiny little bones on the hand and so on that protruding just a little bit, and that makes a lot of difference. You can see this is round, and in the reference it's more triangular. See how nitpicking I am, but if you want to get to the next level of drawing, you need to be that much more precise. This line here in the reference is here, and it would be a little bit inward. This area in terms of hair, this is just purely a technique issue. If you're using very soft charcoal and very sharp edge of a rubber eraser, you should be able to create an effect that's more like what's in the reference. I don't think for drawings like this, you can achieve this kind of the darkness required with wheel charcoal or vine charcoal. You can use those for the preliminary. This drawing has similar mistake as what I mentioned before, in that the head is too high when it should be more like this, right? This is the mistake seems like everybody's making. Look at this area again, it's too bright. The darkness of this entire area doesn't exist in your drawing. So pay a bit more attention to the value of things like that before you start to adding all the hairs and so on. The body, this line is good, but if you look at the reference, it's more like this, or should I say maybe this, right? If you look at the reference, it doesn't have this angle that come out. Again, the precision that I'm pointing out and the mistake that I'm pointing out is very demanding. So if you're new, you know, for example, if this is like the second time you ever draw something, this is extremely good. So any of the correction that I make is not for this drawing in particular, but for everybody to notice and learn something from. For example, you can see that here the hair should be here. It's almost horizontal with a slight tilt. Okay, let's move on to some skull drawings. Now looking back, I probably could pick a reference of the skull that's a little bit easier, because what I have given you guys is rather complicated, especially with the tone value. It's a little bit more flat than if I were to give you another reference. And there's a lot more details out there to distract you. But nevertheless, let's go over some things that I see. What you have is the curve here. On the reference, the curve is more like this. So the bump is not as obvious. And by similar manner that I just look at the details a little bit, you can tell that this eye is shaped like this, right? In the reference, it is more like that. If you look at the nose, for example, in the reference, it comes out like this, almost like 45-degree angle. Actually, a little bit even more horizontal than 45-degree angle. And in your drawing, if you look at the highlight, now if you compare the highlights between your drawing and the reference, it becomes a little bit more clearer. The illusion that you create in the reference, the nose is more like this, right? It's pointing downward like that. And if you look at your reference, the nose is not pointing down like this. quite difficult for this drawing. Once you get the large form right, and you should then focus on the medium sized forms, right? Key points and then the details. That way you ensure at every level the drawing remains correct. And another example that just becomes very obvious is like if you look at this shape here and then look on the reference, you can see that the shape is actually like that. I know it doesn't make that much difference again on this scale, the skull, but let's say you're doing something a bit more sensitive to proportions, that's a pretty big difference. And in terms of the overall value, this one's a very tricky one because the reference image itself is kind of flat. And I'll show you guys what to do when the reference itself is very complex, has a lot of different values, and is overall kind of flat in another drawing. Because this whole area should be darker as it slowly moves towards there. If I were to do a structure line, right, it would be a shape that's like this, and with the nose immediately protruding out quite a bit. The shading between here and here, of course, should be very different. But if you are new, this is a very difficult drawing, of course. Now I'm giving you guys an example of a very good skull drawing. As you can see how close it is to the reference. However, this is why, to be precise in art is so important. This is very close to the reference. I would say there is, say, a mistake of 5 to 10%. That 5 to 10% translate to quite a bit of a difference. Again, it's kind of not fair for me to give you guys this drawing. However, let me show you how nuanced and precise you should be, since it's very rare for anybody to be able to replicate the values in a drawing to like 98%. So if you were to divert your drawing from the reference, especially with a reference that is like this one where it's there but there's so many different values on there and they're very close to each other, and the form, unless you're doing it so precise, it tends to get lost in translation. And if you were to divert from the reference, you should divert it in a way that shows the form more. And what you did is very accurate, but you're doing it in the direction that's a bit more flat. So yours is probably just 5% more flat. As seen the value here, this entire value in this area should be a bit darker. And references are just references. Sometimes you can deviate from the reference a little bit, but the deviation should be in the direction that shows the 3D form more, not less. So for example, for this one, I took your drawing and I spent about less than 5 minutes. Simply make this area a little bit darker and emphasize certain highlights over here. And make some of the areas such as eye sockets a little bit darker. And I'm going to show you now right next to yours, and you can see the difference. You see how by doing so, even though my adjustment to your drawing is, you can say that some part is a little bit darker than what the reference is, but because I deviate my drawing from the reference in a direction that creates even more apparent form, this 3D form and curvature and contrast. People probably look at the first one compared to the reference and say, wow, that's really good, and it is. But then you can see how if I just made it a little bit darker, add some more highlights, especially if you look at areas such as the eye sockets, it's darker and it's more in line with the reference. And I made this entire area darker. So this illusion of 3D curvature is more apparent, and on yours you can see that it's a little bit flatter. So references are there as a reference. Almost nobody can get it to a 98 or even 95% of precision. But that 5% of divergence from the reference should be in the direction of more contrast and more form instead of less. This way, even if your drawing is off in terms of the shade here, in my version they're more overall darker. So you can now compare and see that the right one is slightly more appealing and more obvious in its convey of form. The smaller I make the image, the more apparent this effect becomes. This skull is the second try by this artist. I'm not going to roast you on the first try, since you correctly recognize some of the mistakes. Just some things that I can notice, and you got to, the better your drawing is, the more pickier I'm going to be. Look at the direction of the nose. You can notice on the reference, the nose is even more tilted. You should be able to feel based on seeing this kind of issue. For example here, in the reference, more like this, right? So it doesn't have one side that is so long than the other. So you see the shape of the right socket is like that. And in your drawing, and I can just trace it over, and you can see that the eye socket is like this. Now, are they very similar? Yes. Do they have at least 10% of difference? Yes. And that 10% of difference is going to give you a lot of headache later on as you progress to more complex drawings, such as a portrait or figure drawing. And just a note to everyone that you should adjust the brightness a little bit so that the brightest part of your drawing should always equal to pure white. Like this. This is much more similar to what you actually see on the paper, I would believe. And if you look in the reference, this is a little bit like that instead of a more narrower triangle. But honestly, like everything else, it's pretty good. You even did the slight indentation here, the slight curve that's inward, and then another slight curve inward there. Things like that, especially on a human figure or face, is extremely important. For beginners, this is almost impossible for you to correct. So now if you just focus on just that line, if you look at your drawing and look back at the reference, you can probably see it more obviously. But over time, you'll be able to become more and more accurate with little things like that. If you look at this area here, that's the exact same value as the brightest part in the drawing. In the reference. But on your drawing, they're almost exactly the same. When in doubt, like I mentioned, make sure the structure shows up more, not less, even if you have to deviate from the reference a bit. This part here actually tells a lot about the structure of the skull and where the light hits. And in your drawing, you should make the edge of that area a little bit more sharper, just like in the reference. Again, the angle of the nose should be pointing down slightly. This seems to be also an issue that I see. Now that you have the image side by side, you can see that the angle of the nose from the reference again should be like this, and almost everybody, right? They try to make the angle of the nose is not protruding out as much as it should. So yeah, overall this skull reference that I gave you guys is just more difficult because there is secondary light. There's a lot of rebound light from, primary light is this way, and then there is a lot of rebound light from a bunch of directions, leaving even the reference not as cinematic and dramatic as it should be. So maybe I'll pick a different skull and have you guys practice next. And lastly, I just want to briefly, it's not the scope of this class, but I see it, so I might as well just point something out. When you do a portrait, see this portrait will be like right in between a cartoon and realism, because you're using a lot of lines to define the shape of the nose. In real life, would you see like a sharp line like right there? No, you would not, right? Also in real life, like would you see a line right here? No, you don't. And I don't have your reference, but I pretty much can guarantee that the area here is not going to be the same tone as, the area here. In your drawing, it's very much flat. It's very flat. You should have this, this idea of like a curvature, and then overall like this curvature, that feel should be much stronger. I can tell that this area is a little bit darker, but that feel should be a lot more stronger. And if the reference is very flat, let's say this person has light right in front of them, when you draw it, you don't have to follow the reference 100%. You can move your drawing to the direction where it shows that 3D form a little bit more, just like what I did with the skull earlier. And especially when you're doing commissions and so on. That's my specialty, but it's beyond the scope of this class for now. And here's the last one I want to talk about today. This person has the reference, and I'm just going to put the reference here. I'm going to assume first of all your paper is not red, so it's just the color of a reddish yellowish color. So it's just the lighting in the environment. So you should always, maybe you are using a color paper, but if it's black and white, just turn the image to black and white so it's easier for me to see. When you draw stuff like this, if this is not a commission, the reference you picked is extremely difficult. It's almost like the skull that I picked, because the very image itself overall is not very apparent in its form. So it's much more difficult for you to draw everything. If the lighting comes from a particular angle, such as Rembrandt lighting that's coming at a quarter angle, it's much easier for you to draw a face that looks correct in its major form. This is why you should be able to draw, say, the skull to 90 to 95% accuracy before you spend too much time doing portraits. Like one of the most significant thing that just jump out at me is really the eyes, right? The eyes in the reference is very proportioned at an angle, but the eyes you draw is, not as proportioned. And look at the nose bridge. In the nose bridge, in the reference, the nose bridge is actually quite nuanced. There is something that comes down here and it comes back here, and then it comes back here, and then there's another little shade here, and it's overall wider than the nose you have drawn. So you can see how nuanced all this and more difficult, right, the nose is. And if you look at your nose bridge, it's much more straightforward because you are not pay attention to and recognize the importance of these kind of little shadings on there. Your nose bridge becomes just like very one-dimensional, or should I say two-dimensional in this case. When in the drawing there is clearly this kind of feel, right? Kind of rounded feel. Especially here is different, and as in the reference, as it comes down here, this part here, there's a little bit of round feel. And here is a little bit more flat, but it goes to round to the side very quickly. See, this is why you should be able to draw the forms and the shades of other references that I gave you before you before you spend too much time on portraits. But overall, like, the proportion is not that bad. Portraits are just significantly difficult. If you look at, for example, where the hair is parting, it should be here. Should be right around here, like this. If I were to teach somebody portrait, this would not be the reference that I would give to them to practice. At least definitely not in the beginning. Maybe after they have gained like so much experience. Otherwise, I would probably start with something like a sculpture with very defined surface areas, and then drawings that is very symmetrical and with a clear lighting that shows the entire form of the head. And then I'm moving to something like this at some point where it's just much more nuanced. You have to get everything super accurate in order to have the form looks as good as what it is in the reference. Like this area here, and then compared to this area here. In your drawing, they're more or less similar, right? They're kind of with a similar texture, similar variation of shade, but overall similar value. And if you look at the reference, this part here is significantly darker. You clearly understand the technique of drawing those strands of hair, of those highlights. And you can add a little extra hair that's not in the reference, which is fine, but you also have to understand lighting. So based on the lighting in this reference, there would not be like here, like there, I can tell structure wise here, like all over the place where the hair would not be as bright as what you have drawn. Because this part of the hair, right, would cover this part of the hair. Therefore, this part of the hair would be quite dark as layer wise it's beneath the other layer. So you have to really understand lighting and everything and take them into consideration in order to do, especially a portrait such as this. It's just super difficult. I'm glad to see you try it. Just don't spend too much time on it. Otherwise, your time can be spent more efficiently by doing the other exercises and doing them very well. And just allocate maybe 20% of your time on doing portraits if you really like portraits. And gradually spend more time doing portraits as the other exercises, references become extremely easy and you can do them very, very accurately. Alright guys, I think I got most of you. Eventually there'll be more members, so I will not be able to get to everybody's drawing. However, any drawing that I do tweak or have comments on should benefit everyone. You should be benefit from this kind of video a lot. And again, there will be saved and accessible on the classroom and feedback videos. And those of you who are new, you're always welcome to watch the previous videos. And once again, I have added the reference module where all the references are. Alright guys, until next time, cheers.